Professional Reflections. The title of this year's conference is Search, Expose, Heal. And in that, we have designated 4 separate topics each week of this month. This week's topic is healing from grief. If you've taken the time to view last night's content, Miss Tina Franklin sharing her story of losing her mother in 2019, I just want to say that you probably now understand the heaviness of this topic. I want to say that as we navigate through this week, you might find moments to be triggering, and some things just aren't going to produce those happy feelings that we often search for. So with that being said, I want to emphasize the importance of viewing this content responsibly and encourage you to seek professional help if some of this triggers you in a way that is unmanageable. And even if it's not unmanageable, if it raises some things that you know now that you didn't know before that you might need to work on and sort through, I encourage you to do that with a professional. Grieving is something that we all eventually must go through. Despite how personal grief can be, though, it's important that we don't navigate that alone. Yes, you have family and friends, and it's tempting to lean on those people, but what happens when all of those people are going through that same grief and loss that you're going through at the same time? I learned that last year after losing my grandmother. I had my own grief that I needed help to navigate, but my family was also grieving the very same loss. So not everyone was in a position to help me because they were trying to navigate their own stuff. So how do you move forward in that? I think sometimes it can be beneficial to talk about your feelings and your emotions and evaluate where you are in a process of grieving with someone that can assess it outside of the loss. Someone that, while they may have gone through their own, they are not currently experiencing the same loss that you're experiencing. They've been trained, they've been through this enough with enough people and gathered enough information to offer you really good tips, tricks, and tools to make sure that your grieving process is a healthy one. With that being said, tonight's message is going to be from Janae Tidwell. She is a licensed professional counselor here in Houston, and I think she offers a great perspective and insight into what this looks like and what we need to be aware of as we navigate the process before we even step into a professional's office.
Hello everyone. My name is Janae Tidwell, and I'm a licensed professional counselor here in the Houston area. I want to thank Devin for the opportunity again to give some reflections in regards to the video that was submitted for this week that focused on trauma in the form of grief. I want to thank the individual that provided the video and her being so candid about her process of grief over the years, where she's had multiple losses of her parents. First, want to focus in on grief as it is a process, and I don't know if we often talk about that. I think we as a society don't do well in talking about the loss of a loved one or death as it is in other cultures and other societies. Death is something that is definitely talked about. Lives are celebrated, and I think in the African American community it takes an interesting spin, especially in the Christian African American community, as we talk about, we have celebrations, homegoing celebrations, right, for loved ones who have passed on. But I don't think we do a good job overall of talking about what to do with grief. How to work through it and experience those emotions and get to the other side of the pain that can be associated with grief. Now, please hear me when I say I don't know if there's ever a moment where you may not have some type of emotional reaction to grief, where it stops hurting per se. But there should definitely be a space and time where you get to a point where you can go and live your day-to-day life and be in those moments, be present in those moments without having consistent pain, right? And that's where we get to the trauma of grief. It's that consistency in being in pain rather than having moments where you're triggered and then you have to work through and process through those moments. So just a few overall reflections. One thing that came to mind in reviewing her testimony is that, you know, faith is not a substitute for feelings. And she spoke about how sometimes it's looked down upon to have distressing emotions when dealing with grief or loss in the African American or in the Christian community, because we are supposed to be celebrating life and having faith that this individual has passed to the other side, right? But faith is not a substitute for feelings. You know, God gave us the ability to have both faith and feelings. And so we have those to then express things through them. And so there are emotions that are going to be very fitting in the place of grief and loss, like anger and depression, maybe sadness, maybe an area of bartering, right? When she kind of talked about that, I wish I could have her back. I would do this to have her back. And in her testimony, she said that's not a place that she's at in the moment, but some people do that. So there are oftentimes a lot of emotions associated with grief and loss, and all of those definitely need to be expressed. Having faith is not a substitute for dealing with that emotional expression of grief and loss. So if it is that you find that you keep getting stuck in these emotions surrounding a loss of a loved one, please definitely seek out someone to help you process through that grief, because it is a very unique place to be emotionally that is not easy, and to know what to do and how to move forward. Again, we as a society don't do well in helping us be prepared for that. And I'll be honest, I don't know how much preparation can be done, because each loss is unique, right? This individual losing her father when she was younger versus losing her mother as an adult, both of those completely different losses, and she had different experiences for both, right? So nothing completely prepares you, but I do think that you can be assisted through the process of grieving and realizing that you're gonna probably need faith to deal with those feelings. You can't have it either or when it comes to grief and loss. The second point to make, and I think I've kind of alluded to it already, is that grief is a process, right? You're gonna walk through that thing, and I think you're gonna especially walk through it in the first year of loss. The individual, she alluded to, like, this is the first of everything, right? The first Mother's Days, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, all of these moments that would be normal times that you would spend with that loved one. They are now going to be the first time you do not do it with that loved one. And so the first entire year that you are without that loved one, I tell all of my clients, I said, this is going to be a doozy. This one's going to be the hard one, because we've got a whole 365 days of firsts. And that is so very difficult. So realize that you've got to move through the process and take kind of each day at a time when it comes to grief and loss. Because again, if we are processing those emotions, things should get easier and smoother as time goes on. You should be able to live days that you're not in pain, right? And not saying that there won't be painful moments, but every day should not be a day in pain. So definitely please keep that in mind as you're working through your grief and loss. And then I love how she talked about she's got some coping skills, right? She alluded to the fact that she utilizes music, and music can either be a positive coping skill for her or it can be a negative coping skill. It depends on how she utilizes it. And I do think coping skills are going to be key in the process of grief and loss. Understanding what it is that you need to do that's specific to you, that is going to help you emotionally in that moment. And understanding what you could do that may hinder you or harm you in that moment. I think we all know this thing right here is going to be good for me, but this thing right here, though it may hit a spot, in the end, it's not going to be what I need. But I may indulge myself anyway, right? And so for some people that's food, for others that is spirits or wine, for some that may be a recreational use of a substance, right? But you've got to understand what your coping skills are, whether they're going to be beneficial in the moment or beneficial in the long term, and then know how to use them with wisdom. That's so key and vital in dealing with any distressing emotion, is really having your list of coping skills that you can turn to and knowing how to use them to improve your emotional state in that moment, right? And then finally, I just want to thank her for her transparency in regards to the work that she has done and the work that she has not done when it comes to dealing with her grief and loss. And she owns some stuff, right? She said there's some things that maybe she still needs to work through. And even in giving her testimony, things were coming out and coming to light maybe of stuff that she's like, yeah, I recognize it, but I haven't tackled it yet. You know, I think there's a place for that where we can say, I'm not quite ready yet, and I realize that I have to do this work, and I know that it's going to be a lot for me to do. I haven't gotten up enough strength, haven't mustered up enough courage or endurance to do that work. So I always tell people, walk into that counseling office when you know you're ready to do the work. Now, let's not be fearful of the work. That's key. We can't be afraid of the emotional process that's to come. But if you're ready for it, and you know with the onion peel, right, that we're going to peel back some layers, and it can get deep, and it can maybe get painful, and again, it could get better or it could get worse before it gets better, right? We can't be afraid of that. We got to know that healing can happen and trust the process of it. But we also got to be ready for it. We can't walk in naive and thinking that we're just going to skate through this thing, because dealing with grief and loss is absolutely a process that is full of work. It is full of emotion. It is going to drain you even more than just the missing and the grieving of that loved one. It's going to pull on you. So make sure you're ready to do the work, but don't be afraid of it, and don't neglect it, because to get stuck in grief, right, is the last thing that we want to do, to kind of be stuck in that place of anger, of depression, of bitterness, and the fact that we've lost our loved one. That is essentially sucking the life out of us and the days that we have here on earth left, rather than truly being able to live it to its fullest and celebrate your life and even the life of the one that has passed on. So thank you so much for your time. I hope these moments of reflection were helpful. If it has brought something up for you that you are now saying, hey, you know what, I need to deal with that, please reach out to Devin, or you can reach out to myself, Janae Tidwell, and we would be more than happy to connect you and make sure that you get the help that you need in dealing with trauma associated with grief and loss. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Janae. Your points are always insightful. They're always things that you hear, but it's often good to be reminded of. Some of them are epiphanies that we don't think about. One of the things that I think you touched on as you referred to the African American culture, the Christian community, you know, death is treated differently in different cultures. And that's something to be mindful of as we seek professionals. There are traditions in varying cultures and varying countries and ethnicities, and even within families, that we have to be aware of. We have to be sensitive to. So one culture, you know, does one thing, one culture does another thing. So that's something to be mindful of as you are navigating this grieving process. What does that look like for you as a human being, as someone a part of a different community, as a family member, as a Christian or Hindu or something? You know, there are various ways to mourn, and every culture has its own ways. So I think that's something we need to be mindful of, and pointing that out in a video, is important because we have a different perspective. We see it differently. We culturally are different in how we mourn for the most part. Americans, we mourn differently than other countries. We do different things. We have different traditions, and it's important to note that. And within our country, we have so many other ethnicities and so many different religions, which is the beauty of our country, but we all navigate and have different traditions when it comes to death and mourning and grieving. So with that being said, I thought it was interesting that you pointed that out, and I like that you pointed it out because sometimes our differences are important when we have to navigate something personally. No, they shouldn't divide us. No, they shouldn't be exacerbated or pointed out as a means to segregate, but I do think it is something we should keep in mind when we're personally trying to navigate emotions, when we're personally navigating past experiences and how they impact us today. So just a side note, I guess. One of the most important things you pointed out is that faith is not a substitute for feelings, and in fact you might need your faith to navigate through this grieving process. Pointing out that all of the emotions we feel with grief, one, knowing that in grief we're going to go through stages of anger and sadness and anxiety and all kinds of different things that we tend to try to ignore, we tend to try to pretend don't happen. So understanding that every one of those emotions needs to be addressed is important. That's not something you often do, when you're angry. Especially even outside of death, when we're angry, we try to suppress those emotions instead of getting to the bottom of what is making me angry right now. So being angry when someone passes is natural. It happens, but addressing what that anger stems from, addressing why, if it's rooted in regret, if it's rooted in feeling like someone didn't do something they should have, navigating through that anger is important because it helps you move to the next step. Each loss is unique. Tina pointed out that she had lost her father at a young age, and that was due to alcohol poisoning. So he was young when he passed, and she was young when he passed. She was a young child. So her understanding of death was different. But also, he was young, and this wasn't something that was planned. This wasn't something that she could have mentally prepared for if it had happened later in life. So losing someone tragically versus losing someone due to natural causes or something that you knew could happen and you were prepared for it, but you were just waiting on that day is very different. So understanding that each loss is going to be unique. You're going to navigate each loss differently. You're going to feel differently after each loss. I lost my grandfather in 2013, and it felt different than losing my grandmother. I can't remember every bit of it or every bit of my grief, but I do know that it was different when my grandfather passed versus when my grandmother passed, simply because he had dealt with Alzheimer's and there were things that he had forgotten by the time he passed away. He did not recognize me as me. So a lot of that due to the fact that we lived in different states, but understanding that he didn't know me and he couldn't do the things that he wanted to do, there was a bit of relief simply because of what he was going through here on earth. When my grandmother passed, it was different. It was a different feeling, and it was something different I had to navigate. The loss was unique to me. So keeping that in mind as we navigate this is important, in my opinion. When you said if we are processing these emotions, it should get easier. That we can have these moments where we're overwhelmed, but those shouldn't be days, those shouldn't be weeks, those shouldn't be months. And that's something to evaluate, right? I've been sad about my grandmother, but how long was I sad? What did it impact? Did it keep me from functioning and doing the things that I should do? Does it keep me or prevent me from moving forward in my life and living my life as I know she would want me to do? So understanding that processing is, and understanding that that's an evaluation of how well you're doing is important. Processing those emotions will tell you if you're doing it right. So it should get easier. The days that go by, yes, Mother's Day is going to be really hard. It's a really tough trigger for someone who just lost their mom. It was tough this year because this was the first one without my grandmother, which made me realize I did not even acknowledge Mother's Day last year because of it. So that's something we have to all understand, is that we can have our moments, but the prolonged moments, those prolonged moments of despair and loss, we have to adjust, we have to evaluate, we have to talk about, we have to talk through and push through so that we know we are grieving in a healthy way. Again, the point of this week is not to tell you you're doing it wrong. It's to help you do this in a healthy way that moves you forward and ultimately honors the person that you are grieving. Coping skills. Janae talked about it. Tina mentioned music being a tool she uses that can help uplift her, but at times it can kind of push her back into that place of sadness. And everyone's going to cope differently. Everyone's going to find that thing that works for them. So I know for me, my coping skill when my grandmother passed didn't work initially. You know, I decided to focus on work. I decided to focus on things outside of my grief, and it did not work. And many of you saw a very public breakdown for me. So that changed my world. And it changed my perspective. And what I did was finally say, I need to navigate this with someone with more experience than me. I need to talk to someone. I need to address the things that were underlying before my grandmother passed that are preventing me from passing right now. I'm sorry, not passing, preventing me from progressing right now. Understand that your coping skills are going to be unique to you, and you have to evaluate, are they helping or hurting? Like I said, what I was doing up front was not helping. Do not be afraid of the work. So it is a process. We have to, learn to trust the process. This was something we talked about last week at length. What does trust mean? Trusting that this process is meant to benefit you. Trusting that this process is not going to be easy, but it is going to be vital and beneficial. Trusting that the process, while it is not going to be peaches and roses and lilies and sunshine, trusting that the process is going to ultimately get you to a better place is important. So just one last thing that she said that I think we all can agree with is that you can't neglect your grief. You can't neglect this process. You can't lose someone you love and pretend that they don't exist anymore, that they weren't here before. So when we talk about not neglecting your grief, this stems so many areas, stems from so many things and touches so many areas. So we talked a little bit on Monday about grieving not just being about the death of a loved one or someone you knew or a pet. Grieving, you might need to grieve the loss of a job. You might need to grieve the loss of a future that you had envisioned. So in your process, you need not neglect the grief that you were going through. So I hope that these professional reflections have been helpful. I understand there's a lot of noise out here, but I'm trying to allow myself some free space and get some fresh air. You can get locked in. This is also a part of my grieving process. My healing process is to change my scenery and step outside, breathing in fresh air rather than being cooped up in the house during this quarantine. I mean, this topic is heavy, and I recognize that a lot of people don't want to talk about it. A lot of people don't want to hear about it because, again, watching last night's video, even though I posted it, even though I had viewed it several times before posting it, it was still heavy, it was still hurtful. It was still something that was hard to listen to and watch for myself, because this is not that simple thing that you just do it and you just say it out loud and it goes away. So during a time where we see numbers spiking of people passing from coronavirus and things like that, I just while it's not a pretty topic, while it's not an easy thing to discuss, I do think it is timely, and I do think that it is necessary, because this is yet another thing that adds on to that pile of grieving the loss of a loved one. So with that being said, we will be back tomorrow with our spiritual reflections. I hope that this information is helpful to you. Please don't hesitate, and go ahead and feel free to share, like, comment. Our live discussion will be Thursday at 7, and I would love to be able to start that with the feedback from anything that you guys have questions on, things that you guys want to address during that. Our last live session was actually really, really great. We got to some really good subjects, which we will repeat again this Thursday. So again, thank you for viewing, and we will see you tomorrow.